Welcome students to lecture 1. In this lecture, I will talk about some of the basic concepts in ethics. You can find this presentation on my website 123philosophy.wordpress.com, and I'm going to go over slides 1 through 22. If you have taken other philosophy courses, you remember that philosophy has many different branches. Typically, philosophers divide these branches into 5: metaphysics, epistemology, logic, aesthetics, and ethics. What is ethics? Ethics, or often referred to as moral philosophy, is the branch of philosophy that studies morality. What is morality? Morality is the sphere of human behavior that generates question of right and wrong conduct. The term ethics itself derives from the Greek word ethikos, which means habit or custom. There are 4 areas of ethics that we will be studying on this semester. These 4 areas are value theory, normative ethics, meta-ethics, and applied ethics. Let me talk about these 4 areas one at a time. The first one is value theory. Value theory is the area concerned about what is good, what is valuable in and of itself. What makes life good? For example, is it happiness that is valuable in and of itself and makes the life of a person a good life? Or is getting what you want? Or is it only one thing? Or many things? Or, for example, is it virtue? These are some of the questions that are studied under value theory. The second area of study is normative ethics. This is the area that people have in mind when they think of ethics. This is the area of ethics concerned about determining the set of principles of right action. In other words, those who study normative ethics worry about how to determine what we ought to do. How can I go about determining what is right for me to do? Now, a useful way to characterize ethical systems is to divide them into 2 types: deontological and teleological. Deontological theories are those theories of morality that recommend universal rules. For example, if you are a religious person, you get your morality from your religion. And your religion gets the rules of morality from a divinity, a god. So according to that particular religion, let's say, for example, that a particular religion says you ought to help elderly people cross the street. That would be the rule of morality. And typically, deontological theories say that these rules are, have to be followed and never deviated. Teleological theories, on the other hand, are theories that are based on the outcome of our actions. I will give you an example. The divine command theory is what I just explained a moment ago. This says that you have to act in such a way as to conform with God's commands. This is an example of a deontological form of morality. As an example of a teleological form of morality, consider utilitarianism. Utilitarianism is often described with the motto, the greatest happiness for the greatest number. What does that mean? It means that according to utilitarianism, the right thing to do for you, for me, is the thing that maximizes the amount of happiness for the greatest number of individuals involved. For example, notice the difference between a deontological theory and a teleological theory, such as utilitarianism. You worry whether you should lie in a particular circumstance. You imagine the circumstance. A deontologist might say to you, you're not permitted to lie, ever, no matter what. On the other hand, a utilitarian would say that your lying depends on the consequences caused by your lying. For example, if you find yourself in a certain circumstance in which your lying will lead to desirable consequences. For example, if you lie, you will save the lives of 1,000 people. Well, according to a utilitarian, you are obligated to lie in that circumstance because saving the lives of 1,000 people is more important than the act of lying or telling the truth. On the other hand, a deontological theory might say to you that it doesn't matter the consequences. You should never lie because lying itself is wrong in and of itself. Whereas for a utilitarian, lying is neither wrong nor right. It becomes right or wrong on the basis of the consequences and how the consequences are capable of generating the most good for the greatest number of individuals. Another example of a normative theory is the social contract. This was actually born as a political theory, but as Aristotle used to note, politics is related to morality. The social contract essentially says that people come together and form a unity, a community, and they accept a hypothetical or imaginary contract where they give up their freedom in return for certain things from the state, from the government. One particular form of the social contract is known as the veil of ignorance, where you decide, you make your moral decisions from behind a veil of ignorance. The way it works is the following. Suppose that they ask you to deliberate on certain moral issues. But what do you know? All you know is the moral issues, but you don't know who you are. What I mean is, You don't know whether you are a male or a female or your sexual preferences. You don't know your ethnical background. You don't know anything. All you know is that you are a human being. And you know about the moral issue itself. Now, what are you going to decide? You see that by using this veil of ignorance, the idea is, since you don't know who you are, you have to be careful what you're going to decide. Let's say that you decide, for example, that only females of a certain age will rule the world. Well, if you are a male, you're not going to be happy about it. So from behind the veil of ignorance, before you know your sex, your age, your ethnical background, you have to be careful and be very conscientious of what you decide. Another form of deontological ethics is what is known as prima facie duties. This is very complicated, but just to give you a sense, it is very similar to deontology, where there are certain rules that you have to follow. The difference, however, is that these rules are prima facie duties or rules. What that means is that they are rules, but they're not fixed. You can always change them in case they conflict. Another form of morality, which is, I have to say, neither teleological nor deontological, is virtue ethics. Well, virtue ethics is a family of many different virtue theories. Typically, what they agree to is that rather than focusing on the right action, what I ought to do, it is more productive, more profitable to concentrate on learning how to become a good individual. An individual who is compassionate, just, and so on. We are going to talk about this more in detail later during the semester. Another example, the final example, is feminist ethics. Feminist ethics is the idea that ethical theory has been created and dominated by males. So starting in the late 60s, many philosophers came up with the idea that in order to advance morality, we have to discuss moral issues from the point of view of females, of women, because they have been marginalized throughout history. And they have a lot to say about morality. And a lot of things that differ significantly from what males have to say. One of the biggest problems in ethical theory is the starting point. Where do we start from? Should we start from intuition, or from nature, or from reason itself, or from religion? Let me illustrate what I mean. Every day you're confronted by moral questions. And most likely you have inherited your moral understanding from your parents. But that moral understanding must be based on some principles. Now, these principles, where do we get these principles? There are many ways, as I said, to start a moral system. So these principles might derive from your intuition. By intuition, philosophers mean, what do you feel it is right? So I have a strong intuition that, for example, lying for personal profit is not good. it is immoral. Other people argue that in order to start morality, we have to consider what is nature. Let me give you an example. In the Middle Ages, some philosophers thought that God created nature, created human beings, and everything that we do has to conform with nature. So if you conform with nature, you're doing something right. If you don't conform with nature, you're doing something immoral, something wrong. So that's why many medieval philosophers argue that, for example, abortion is wrong and contraception is morally wrong. Because when you think about it, in nature, contraceptions don't exist. They are created, they are manufactured by human beings. They're not part of nature. And so using contraception will be immoral. Another way to start is reason. Reason, but of course, why should we not start with reason? We should always start with reason, right? But more specifically, what this means is that you will see that there are certain philosophers who argue that the rules of morality can be determined on the basis of what is rational. So what is rational is what is moral. What is irrational is immoral. And finally, I mentioned this earlier, religion. The starting point of morality for many philosophers is God, God's commands. Okay, so the first area of philosophy is value theory. The second is normative theory. The third one is meta-ethics. Meta-ethics is concerned about more general questions in morality. So far, we talked about specifics of morality. How do I determine what is right? God's commands, reason, nature, and so on. Meta-ethics is concerned about more broad, more abstract questions of morality. In the first place, what is morality itself? What is the institution of morality? Is morality something that we discover or something that we invent? Think about language. Language is very precise, it has precise rules, but it's something that is man-made. So some philosophers worry whether morality is discovered, it's already there in the world, or it's invented like language. Another question is, how do we come to know moral duty? Yet another question is, what exactly do we mean by right or good? What is the meaning of moral statements? And finally, how do we form judgments? How do we form judgment? What is it in our psychology, in our minds, that lead us to make certain judgments? There are various theories of meta-ethics. Again, there's a division between cognitivism and non-cognitivism. Cognitivism are ethical theories that argue that ethical sentences express actual proposition that can be true or false. So if I say that slavery is immoral, according to a cognitivist, when I say that slavery is immoral, I am saying something that can be either true or false. This seems obvious, right? But believe it or not, there are many philosophers who argue that that sentence, the sentence, slavery is immoral, cannot be true or false. Why is that? Well, because if something is true or false, it must be true or false relative to something else. Let me give you an example. If I say to you that my brother wears red shoes, is that true or false? Well, you don't know my brother. But if the sentence is true, it must be true on the basis of what? On the basis of whether my brother, in fact, is wearing red shoes. So in other words, sentences are true or false based on certain facts about the world. There are red shoes, there is a brother, he's my brother, he wears red shoes, and these facts make the sentence, my brother wears red shoes, a true sentence. But when I say slavery is immoral, what exactly makes the sentence immoral? What is the immorality of slavery? Well, it seems that the answer would be, well, look at slavery. Isn't it obvious that it is immoral? Well, I have to say, we are going to discuss this later on, so I don't want to say much about this now, at this point. But to answer that question, I would have to say it is not obvious that slavery is immoral. In fact, throughout the centuries, slavery was not only moral, but normal. It is not evident that it is immoral. You have to think about it. You have to get the context. The point is that non-cognitivists believe that moral values do not exist. Moral values are created by human beings, and therefore there is nothing in the world that corresponds to right or wrong, and consequently nothing can be right or wrong. Non-cognitivists then explain moral sentences not as true or false, but as sentences that express non-cognitive states of a person, very raw states. For example, if you're eating pizza and I ask you, how's that pizza? And you respond, mmm. Now this is an expression, an example of a non-cognitive expression, because if I ask you, is true or false? You will say to me, it's neither true nor false, it's just an expression. This is the way non-cognitivists understand moral statements. But as I said, if this sounds complicated now or crazy, don't worry, because we're going to talk about this in detail a little later. Moving on, there's a list. This is a partial list. There are many, many more of meta-ethical theories. We have moral realism that says that essentially there are certain features in the world, in the universe, that make moral statements true or false. Moral subjectivism says that morality is a subjective matter. I, the subject, decide what is right or good or evil or wrong. Similarly, moral relativism says that morality is relative to a particular culture. Then there's moral objectivism, which says that moral claims are true or false independently of what we think. For example, why do we value kindness. A moral objectivist will say that we value kindness because kindness is good, not the other way around. And finally, emotivism and prescriptivism. Emotivism is a non-cognitive moral theory. It says that moral language is not fact stating, but rather it's an expression of our raw feelings. And prescriptivism is the notion that moral claims are commands, prescriptions. Okay, so we talked about value theory, normative ethics, meta-ethics. The fourth area of philosophy, of ethics, is applied ethics. Applied ethics, very simply, is the application of norms. We learn normative ethics. How do we then apply these norms to actual issues in the real world? Some philosophers, I have to say, are skeptical of applied ethics. They argue that in order to solve ethical problems, we shouldn't even rely on normative ethical theories at all. So, to review, we talked about value theory. Value theory is concerned about the good life, what makes a life good, what is good in itself. Normative ethics is concerned about principles of right or wrong. Meta-ethics is concerned with what is ethics itself, whether morality is invented or discovered. And applied ethics is the application of rules and duties to particular areas of the human life. For example, business ethics or medical ethics. These are examples of applied ethics. Now, let me say a few things about doing ethics well. The first point is legality versus morality. This should be obvious, but sometimes it's not. So let me just emphasize this. Some people think that it is possible to determine what is morally right just by considering what is legal. This is not a good idea. Think about it, the things that are legal. It is legal to sell cigarettes. It is legal to cheat on your spouse, to commit adultery. These are legal in the sense that the law permits them, or I should say the law does not punish them. But does it mean that they are morally sound? Not at all. Think about the Nazis. During the war, the Nazis ruled. They had their own rules, their own Nazi rules. They were the norm. They were permitted by the law. But obviously doesn't mean that they are moral. So it is not helpful to determine what is right, what you ought to do, on the basis of what is legal or illegal. The second point that I wanted to make, in order to do ethics well, we should not base our moral decision on the basis of what is the case. Let me give you an example. What is the case is that, for example, um, human beings are capable of eating animals, killing animals, and use animals for food. This seems to be a tradition. Some people might even say that this is natural. It comes natural to human beings. But the question is everything that is natural by default moral? Let me give you an example to show you that it isn't. In 2009, author Christopher McDougall published a very famous book entitled Born to Run. The thesis of this book is that human beings are naturally born runners. But it's obvious that even if that is true, in fact, assume that that is true, we are all human beings naturally born runners. Does that mean that we must be runners? We ought to be runners? Not at all. So what is the lesson that we learned here? The lesson is that from a description of the world, from a description of nature, from a description of humanity, from a description of anything that you want, you can never get a moral ought. Or in other words, from a description, you can never get a prescription. Or from what is the case, you can never determine what ought to be the case. Okay, so this is the end of lecture 1. I hope you enjoyed the lecture. Again, I want to remind you that this lecture is my PowerPoint presentation that you can find on my website, 123philosophy.wordpress.com. And I just covered slides 1 through 22. I see you next time. Bye-bye.